In the judge's chambers, silence settled like dust, heavy and unmoving. The mahogany desk, once polished to a mirror sheen, now bore the marks of years, rings from coffee mugs, light scratches from impatient pens. Judge Banks sat in his high-backed chair, unmoving, staring at the file he had just closed. His fingers tapped against the folder with a rhythm that betrayed his usually controlled exterior. For most, this was another petty theft case, quickly dismissed or buried in legal process. But for him, this case cracked open a door he thought had long been sealed. With a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, Judge Banks rose and crossed the room. From a low cabinet against the wall, hidden behind stacks of court records and a rusted plaque from a judicial conference 2 decades past, he retrieved a small, locked metal box. The key was still on his ring, though he hadn't used it in years. He turned it slowly, the latch clicking with a metallic finality. Inside, the box smelled faintly of old paper and polished brass. Time had yellowed the corners of its contents, official documents, letters creased by decades of folding and unfolding, and one photograph curled at the edges from heat or memory. The photo was black and white, taken in Iraq during one of the most brutal summers of 2005. Dust clouds formed halos around the soldiers. In the center, a younger William Banks knelt, clutching his arm, his uniform dark with blood at the shoulder. Behind him, a soldier, muscles taut, expression unreadable, was hauling him by the vest strap through sand and chaos. Mortar fire blurred the background, and the Humvee behind them was engulfed in flames. Banks' eyes, even then, had been filled not with fear but disbelief. On the back, scrawled in ink that had faded but not disappeared, was a simple inscription, Ramadi, 05, Tucker pulled me out. North Sector. The judge ran his thumb over the name. Tucker. He repeated it quietly, as if saying it aloud would summon the man from the photo into the room. Earl Tucker. The homeless defendant in the holding cell downstairs. The man whose wrists had been cuffed despite his thin frame. The man who had saved him. Still holding the photograph, Banks turned to his desktop computer and typed slowly, methodically, as though each keystroke carried weight. He accessed the secure Federal Veterans Database, a resource judges could request in cases involving service-related matters. It was rarely used. But today, he bypassed the usual protocol and searched by full name and partial service number, the last digits he had glimpsed on the report. The screen flickered and then loaded a full service history. The words glared back at him like a confession. Earl Tucker. Staff Sergeant. 22 years of active service. Expert in logistics and combat medical evacuation. 3 overseas deployments. Decorations: Bronze Star for Valor, Army Commendation Medal, Combat Action Badge. A commendation from Central Command detailed his role in a critical 2005 convoy rescue. When a supply route near Ramadi was ambushed, Tucker had coordinated a defensive perimeter, then ran into the fire zone to extract 2 wounded men, one of them, a young field medic named Lieutenant William Banks. Banks stopped reading. He closed his eyes, the screen's glow dancing across his eyelids. The memory came back, uninvited but complete. The sharp smell of fuel, the stinging smoke, the sound of his own voice crying out, half a scream, half a plea, as the shrapnel burned his shoulder. And then the blur of movement, strong arms lifting him, dragging him backwards, yelling over the G** fire to stay low. He never saw the man's face clearly then, but the tattoo, just above the wrist, was unforgettable, a hawk perched on a compass. The very same one he glimpsed today on the arm of an old man in tattered clothes. How had this happened? How had someone like Earl fallen so far, so silently? Banks reached into the box again and retrieved an old commendation letter Tucker had written on his behalf after the rescue, something he'd kept all these years, even though they'd never spoken again. It had arrived with no return address, typed in a way that felt oddly formal. The last line stood out more than ever now. Sir, I only did what was right. We never leave our own behind. Banks stood up slowly, overcome by a wave of shame. Because somehow, he had done exactly that. He had left his rescuer behind, not just once, but for years. While he built a career in law and sat in judgment over others, Earl Tucker had slipped through every net, ignored by a system that should have held him up. A clerical error in 2008, easily missed, easily corrected, had severed Tucker from his pension and support benefits. No follow-up. No red flags. Just silence, until he had become another invisible man living under bridges and behind buildings, scavenging for cans, and finally arrested for trying to eat. Back in the courtroom, none of this was known yet. The docket listed a minor theft charge. The bailiff was bored. The clerks were whispering about lunch. But Judge Banks knew that everything had changed. He left his chambers, walked back into the room, and stared at the bench. It no longer felt like a place of power, it felt like a place of reckoning. He took his seat, though this time the weight of the robe seemed heavier than ever. His mind wasn't on the other cases. His thoughts were with a man who had given everything, only to receive nothing in return. He whispered to himself, barely audible, as he reopened the file and looked once more at the name. We never leave our own behind. He wouldn't leave Earl now. The next morning, the courtroom was unrecognizable. Where there had once been rows of empty benches, a silent sea of uniforms now filled the space: soldiers, veterans, local officers, and quietly weeping civilians. Some wore dress blues, their ribbons catching the soft morning light like stained glass. Others were in fatigues, standing in the back out of habit, not ceremony. Judge Banks had ordered the hearing moved to the main chamber, citing public interest. But it wasn't legal formality that packed the gallery, it was reverence. Word had spread. Not through headlines, not yet. But through whispers. The kind that carried through military bases and veteran halls, passed over cups of strong coffee and hushed breath. A Bronze Star recipient. A forgotten sergeant. Arrested for hunger. The quiet injustice had ignited something in the bones of those who still remembered what loyalty meant. It reached those who still saluted at empty caskets, those who kept medals in drawers beside folded flags. Colonel Mark Henley had flown in overnight. He wore his full dress uniform, every brass detail immaculately shined, every thread pressed. Once Earl's commanding officer in Ramadi, Henley now led the Georgia National Guard's coordination unit. He hadn't seen Earl in nearly 17 years, but the moment he read the internal email about the case, he cleared his schedule and drove through the night. Some debts don't sleep. As court resumed, the usual bailiff announcements felt hollow, robotic. The clerk's voice cracked as he read the case number, State versus Earl Tucker. The defendant, dressed in donated slacks and a borrowed button-up, sat with folded hands and a composure that defied the situation. His beard was still wild, his face still hollow from hunger, but his posture hadn't changed. He sat like a soldier, shoulders square, gaze steady. A lawyer stepped forward, not the overworked public defender who had barely glanced at the case the day before. This was a new face, lean and composed, with the kind of suit that didn't wrinkle. Maria Delgado. A senior attorney from the Federal Veterans Legal Defense Initiative. She introduced herself and immediately requested that all charges be dropped. Judge Banks didn't respond right away. He looked at Earl, then at the crowd, then back at the thin man who had once carried him through death's door. Before we proceed, the judge said slowly, this court will hear testimony regarding the character of the defendant. Colonel Henley rose. When he approached the stand, even the lawyers stopped shuffling papers. Silence fell again, not the uncomfortable kind, but reverent. Sacred. I served with Earl Tucker in Iraq, Henley began, his voice low but unwavering. 3 tours. He was logistics. That meant long hours, bad roads, and no thanks. But Earl never complained. He did more than his job, he saved lives. Mine included. He paused, swallowing thickly. 2005, Ramadi. Convoy ambush. We lost half the lead unit in minutes. Chaos, G** fire, dust so thick you couldn't see your own boots. I was trapped. So was a young medic. Earl, he didn't hesitate. He ran back in. Twice. Pulled us both out. That man sitting there is the reason I'm standing here today. A murmur moved through the room like wind over tall grass. The judge nodded slowly. Next came the investigator from the VA who confirmed what had been uncovered the night before. A 2008 clerical error, one line of code during a server migration, had wiped Earl's benefit eligibility. The system should have flagged it. It didn't. For over 15 years, no payments. No housing voucher. No contact. His case simply vanished. And the kicker, the investigator added, his voice tight. The notice of termination went to a demolished apartment building. No forwarding address. No follow-up. He didn't disappear. We erased him. The judge visibly flinched. Delgado presented records next, copies of Tucker's service medals, honorable discharge papers, commendation letters, even photos of Earl standing beside military vehicles, organizing evacuations, helping injured civilians. A quiet career of courage, erased by a system too busy to care. She closed with a simple statement. This man was punished not for stealing food, but for surviving long enough to need it. Justice doesn't mean procedure. It means memory. It means we remember who we leave behind. When it was time for the prosecution to respond, the assistant DA stood briefly, looked around the room, and said only, "The state withdraws all charges." It was done. But Judge Banks wasn't finished. He stood. The courtroom rose with him, not from command, but instinct. Uniforms straightened. Civilians held their breath. "I have sat on this bench for over 2 decades, he said, voice deep but cracked with emotion. I have seen cases that bent the law. I have seen people slip through cracks. But I have never felt the weight of personal failure like I do today." He looked directly at Earl. "You saved my life, Sergeant Tucker. And I failed to recognize you. But not anymore." He reached beneath the bench and lifted something wrapped in blue velvet. A box, long and narrow. He opened it carefully and held up a medal, his own. It wasn't from the court. It was the Bronze Star he had been awarded after Ramadi. The same one he had quietly stored away, never feeling he had earned it alone. He walked around the bench and, without asking permission, pinned it onto Earl's lapel. "You were the hero that day," he said, his voice steady now. "This was always yours." Gasps filled the room. Not for drama, but because something sacred had happened. Not a performance, not a gesture, but a reckoning. Tears ran down the faces of people who hadn't wept in years. Even Earl, whose eyes had seen too much to cry, blinked quickly as if battling ghosts. Outside the courthouse, the flag on the lawn caught a strong breeze and snapped to full mast. And inside, for once, justice stood taller than the bench. The weeks that followed unfolded like a story retold in every corner of the city, through coffee shop conversations, veterans' halls, classroom lessons, and community centers. The name Earl Tucker, once spoken only in the alleys behind convenience stores or murmured by the city's night shift workers, had become a beacon. No longer just a man in shadows, Earl had become something deeper, a reminder. Of honor. Of oversight. Of how easy it is to forget, and how vital it is to remember. Media outlets picked up the story by the second day. First local, then national. The headline read, "Veteran wrongly arrested for theft turned out to be a war hero who saved the judge's life." Within 72 hours, donations had crossed the $100,000 mark. Veterans wrote in from every state, some offering money, others offering housing, even just a kind letter or a shared memory of a man they remembered from a dusty deployment base long ago. A retired general from Fort Stewart made a personal visit to deliver a plaque, engraved with the words, "To the one who never left anyone behind, even when the world left him." The very store where the theft had occurred, owned by a man once so sure of his judgment, quietly removed the security camera footage from public circulation. In its place, the owner set up a small glass case beside the bread aisle. Inside it sat a folded American flag, a copy of Earl's Bronze Star citation, and a photo of him standing proudly in uniform, younger, back straight, medals in place. A sign above read, "We misjudged a man. This is how we make it right. The courtroom itself changed too. Where Earl had once sat, invisible in threadbare clothes, there now stood a polished bronze plaque installed just beneath the judge's bench. It bore the seal of the United States Army in red, in honor of Staff Sergeant Earl Tucker, whose quiet courage endured beyond the battlefield. Justice begins with remembrance. In city council meetings, discussions began in earnest. Not just of veterans' affairs, but of municipal oversight, homelessness, and the cracks into which people vanish when no one is watching. A proposal that had long gathered dust, a legal assistance program for at-risk veterans, was pulled back into the light. Renamed the Tucker Act, it passed unanimously. For the first time in the city's history, public defenders would work in tandem with the VA to cross-check benefits cases before prosecution. Earl's name was written into the law itself. Earl, for his part, remained unchanged. Not in heart. He moved into a newly built veterans housing unit on the east side of the city, a place with sunlight in the mornings and wide hallways that didn't echo like concrete underpasses. It was simple, modest, but dignified. There, he hung two things, a photo of Sarah, his wife, smiling at a picnic in 1993, and the Bronze Star now encased in wood and glass, set beside a single, dog-eared letter addressed to him, unsigned, typed on old military stationery. It read, "You did not fail her. You honored her memory with your silence, your sacrifice. Come home now. The world remembers." He declined most interviews. Turned down national appearances. Politely refused a feature documentary offer. When asked why, his answer was always the same: "I didn't do anything more than anyone else would have done. I just lasted long enough for someone to notice." But he did speak. Occasionally. Quietly. At local high schools. At city functions. Once at a military academy, where cadets in crisp uniforms sat so still you could hear them breathe. Earl stood in a suit borrowed from a local tailor, his voice gravelly but clear. "I've seen men be brave under fire. That's easy. Real courage is being decent when no one's looking. It's giving when you have nothing left. And it's not just soldiers who do that, it's teachers, waitresses, janitors, neighbors. The world doesn't change because of medals. It changes because of mornings when someone chooses kindness." When he finished, the room rose in silence. Not applause, something quieter, heavier. Respect. At Rosie's Diner, where local veterans sometimes met for breakfast, a table was permanently reserved with a small plaque that read, "Reserved for the ones who came home quietly." Earl was never seen sitting there. But he once walked past it and nodded. That was enough. In the courthouse, Judge Banks continued his service. But something shifted in him. Where once he dismissed minor offenses with weary routine, he now asked questions. Dug deeper. Once, after a hearing, a young veteran charged with disorderly conduct was about to be sentenced when Banks stopped the proceedings. "Son," he asked, "who did you serve under?" The young man blinked, confused. "Colonel Henley, sir." Ramadi. 2005. Banks leaned back, eyes shining. "Then I owe you more than a sentence. I owe you a conversation." And they sat. For an hour. No lawyers. No bailiff. Just two men, the old wounds of war and silence binding them tighter than any record could. Earl continued his quiet life. He still walked the streets, but now he did it with purpose. Children recognized him from school assemblies and waved. Store owners no longer closed their doors when he passed. He became a fixture again, but this time, seen. Known. Sometimes, he would sit in the park on a faded green bench and take from his coat pocket a simple thermos. Steam curled from the top, and he would sip slowly, eyes lost in thought. If you sat close enough, you might hear the rustle of something else in that pocket, a folded letter. Or see him run his fingers over a patch still stitched into his coat, the faded eagle and shield insignia of his old unit. But he never spoke of the courthouse. He never retold the story. Because he didn't have to. The world had finally spoken it for him. And on a stone wall outside the veteran housing facility, etched in granite for every passerby to see, was a final inscription. Kindness without question is enough. Years passed, as years tend to do, quietly, steadily, without asking permission. The city around Earl grew louder, newer, faster. Skyscrapers rose. Schools modernized. The courthouse added another annex. But some things didn't change. A certain park bench remained untouched by city renovations. The plaque at the courthouse never dulled. And every Veterans Day, rain or shine, someone, never the same person twice, left a fresh carnation at the bronze memorial below the judge's bench. The scholarship in Earl's name had grown into something much bigger than anyone imagined. What began as a local fundraiser evolved into the Earl Tucker Civic Fellowship, granting full college tuition to children of low-income veterans pursuing public service. Each year, the chosen fellows would visit Earl's old apartment complex, walk past the bread aisle where his story began, and stand outside the very courthouse where justice had changed course. None of them had ever met Earl personally. He rarely attended the ceremonies, but they all spoke of him. Of what he meant. Of what he stood for. The word they used most wasn't hero. It was anchor. In the quiet corridors of the local VA hospital, staff still recalled the day Earl first walked in after his reinstated benefits came through. He didn't demand anything. Didn't complain. He simply presented his paperwork and asked for a general checkup, his first in 15 years. The nurse on duty said later that it was the calmest intake she'd ever done. When asked if he'd like a wheelchair, he said, "I've walked this far already. Let's not change the pattern." The doctor found signs of old injuries poorly healed, high blood pressure, and scarring from untreated frostbite. But Earl only nodded. "Comes with the territory," he said. He attended every follow-up. Took every prescribed pill. He wasn't trying to live longer, just right. One winter morning, as frost traced its fingers across window panes, the staff at the veteran housing facility found Earl in his chair by the window. His thermos, half full. His coat folded neatly over his lap. A copy of The Old Man and the Sea resting on the armrest, bookmarked near the end. He had passed quietly, sometime during the night, a calm in his face that moved the nurse to tears. There was no next of kin listed, no estate to divide. But there was a legacy. The funeral was held at the city's military cemetery, under gray skies and a soft, respectful drizzle. There was no fanfare planned, but they came anyway, former comrades, judges, school teachers, reporters, students with fellowship pins on their jackets. They stood shoulder to shoulder, filling the cemetery like a formation, not breaking ranks even as rain soaked their coats. A flag was folded. A trumpet played. The final notes of taps drifted like breath into the cold air. Then a quiet moment. No speeches. Just silence. Until one boy stepped forward. He couldn't have been more than 12. Small, with a frame like the child Earl once watched from the shadowed edge of a city street. He wore a blue blazer too big for him and held a folded letter. "My mom says I got this scholarship because of Mr. Tucker," the boy said softly. "She said he gave without asking. So I wanted to give something back." He knelt and placed a single military coin, engraved with the fellowship crest, on Earl's grave. It was joined, one, by others. A coin from the National Guard. A badge from a police officer. A dog tag from a retired Marine. Each person left something behind. Not to honor themselves, but to thank a man who had carried others for so long without asking to be carried in return. The city later renamed the park where Earl once sat. It became Tucker Green. Not a statue. Not a museum. Just open space, sunlight, trees, and a bronze bench with no backrest, just how Earl liked it. Children played there. Veterans met there. And some nights, when the wind blew just right, you could almost hear the clink of a thermos lid. The final page of his file was sealed at City Hall with a ribbon, not a staple. It was placed beneath a small sign on the wall of archived stories that read, "Ordinary Men Who Changed Everything." He hadn't done it with protest. or speeches. He hadn't tried to make history. He had only tried to do good, to help, to endure. And that had been enough to move a city, to rewrite laws, to awaken hearts that had long since hardened. In a world always moving, his life became the pause, the stillness where kindness quietly lived. And that stillness echoed louder than any storm. Because in the end, the truth remains. Kindness without question is enough.